Welcome to Beyond the Ridge, Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center's web series, bringing you interesting stories and interpretations of race, religion, medicine, and war from the 19th century and beyond. My name is Codie Eash, and I serve as Director of Education and Museum Operations at Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center. I'm located in front of the equestrian statue dedicated in June 1896 to Major General Winfield Scott Hancock, placed here by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And we are on East Cemetery Hill, located about a mile southeast of the seminary and Seminary Ridge Museum. Since we opened in July of 2013, one of the more common questions that we get on our most popular visitor experience, the Cupola tour, is how do we know what we know about the use of the cupola as a signal station, as an observation post during the battle in 1863. And largely what we're going to explore over the next few moments is the basis of the story of Brigadier General John Buford using that cupola. And this account comes to us from a relatively under-recognized figure of the battle, and that is First Lieutenant Aaron Brainerd Jerome. Now, to begin this story, let us take a step back in time to October of 1865. It is the middle of that month. 6 months have passed since Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox and the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln. Currently in Washington, D.C., there's a special military commission overseeing a nearly 2-month trial of former Confederate commandant at Andersonville Prison, Henry Wirz. At this point in time, in the early days of Reconstruction, this first fall since the Civil War was effectively concluded, President Andrew Johnson is in the process of paroling ex-Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens. And internationally, there's great excitement looming in anticipation of a solar eclipse, and it would be viewed within the next few days by much of the world's population. Now, here in Gettysburg, nearly 2 years removed from the rebellion's bloodiest battle on the first 3 days of July 1863, there's a correspondent for the New York Herald who observes that, quote, "The extensive amphitheater where death had danced for 3 successive days was now divided into fields of grain and meadow, with here and there a grove of trees or bunch of bushes radiant with the gorgeous foliage of autumn." And that same correspondent from the New York Herald would also note that also here in Gettysburg, Mr. John H. Batchelder, a landscape painter, an early historian of the battle, is compiling sources. He's doing interviews with individuals. He's touring the battlefield. And the Herald correspondent, that Batchelder is the compiler of the elegant isometrical drawing of the battlefield, showing the configuration of the country and the positions of the troops engaged, is now at Gettysburg collecting facts and incidents for a detailed and correct history of the battle. It says that throughout the month of October, he is inviting veterans of the battle, especially officers who served on both sides, and he wants them to visit the field and revive recollections of scenes which they witnessed and a part of which they were. Meanwhile, 60 miles southeast of Gettysburg, a train departs Baltimore, Maryland in the second week of October, 1865, on the Northern Central Railway. On board a special car are several U.S. Army officers. There are brigadier and major generals, lieutenant colonels, staff officers, and aides. There's a Maryland congressman and a renowned German painter. And the figure who they would all accompany on this train here to Adams County, Pennsylvania, the man of the hour, is 41-year-old Major General Winfield Scott Hancock, who commanded the 2nd Corps of the Army of the Potomac here at the Battle of Gettysburg. He has recently, earlier in 1865, served as a supervisor at the execution of the Lincoln assassination conspirators. And now, this fall of 1865, he is the commandant of the Middle Department, which is a division of the U.S. Army headquartered at Baltimore, Maryland. The New York Herald would report of Hancock coming here to Gettysburg that flags are displayed at different places along the route, and people assembled at railroad stations in hopes of catching a glimpse of the general as he passed. At Hanover Junction in southern County, about miles east of here, the same station where President Lincoln in November 1863 changed cars on his way to Gettysburg for the dedication of the National Cemetery, Hancock is now at that same location, and there's an impromptu ovation that erupts when passengers learn that he is aboard their train. Hancock will he'll be here for 3 days. The dates are relatively uncertain. It looks like he's probably here from October 12th to 14th, 1865. And the Baltimore Sun would say that the official purpose of his visit to the Gettysburg battlefield was an inspection of the grounds so that he could report the progress of the National Cemetery back to the Secretary of War in Washington. A few months earlier, on July 4th, the cornerstone of Soldiers National Monument had been dedicated, and General Oliver Howard was the keynote speaker on that occasion. And now we have another VIP, another veteran Corps commander of the battle, returning here to Gettysburg for the first time since the battle a couple of years earlier. The Herald said that Hancock arrived early in the afternoon. This is contrary to an account from the Baltimore American, which said that he got here too late for persons in the town to be aware of the presence in their midst of one of the defenders of their faith in the days of bitter trial and woe. But Hancock is going to be accompanied by John Batchelder, that early historian of the battle, to the Eagle Hotel located at the northeast corner of Chambersburg and Washington Streets, which coincidentally was John Buford's headquarters on June 30th and July 1st, 1863, leading up to the opening hours of the battle. Now, Hancock is going to be invited to deliver a speech, and this is really kind of the basis of the fallout of his visit here at Gettysburg. The Baltimore American would say that it was noised around that General Hancock had arrived, and therefore he was called out vociferously to make a speech by the prominent citizens of Gettysburg. He delivered a rather brief address, about 400 words, from the Eagle Hotel, from a veranda at the top of the hotel. And there were transcripts printed in both the Baltimore American and locally in Gettysburg in the Adams Sentinel. He opened by saying, "Citizens of Gettysburg, it affords me pleasure to meet you here tonight on a ground hallowed by the blood of thousands of martyrs to the great cause of the Union of the States. That cause has won and the question decided." The themes that he talked about were pretty common amongst post-war veterans' addresses. He talked about the preservation of the battlefield and stories for future generations. He gave tributes to generals who died, not just at Gettysburg, but who he knew, who passed after Gettysburg throughout the course of the war. He mentions John Reynolds, the first Corps commander here at Gettysburg. He mentions James Wadsworth, who would die at the Battle of the Wilderness, and Alexander Hayes, who division commander here at Gettysburg, who would also eventually die at the Wilderness. Hancock mentions his pride in being a Pennsylvania veteran who fought this battle and won this battle on his home soil, and he gives gratitude for John Batchelder's early efforts in preserving the field and preserving the stories of the Gettysburg battlefield. And he would close, Hancock, his speech by saying, "The battle is of the past, the war is ended." He mentions the fact that this is my second visit to Gettysburg. The first was amid a clash of arms. Now, he says, I come here surrounded by a frame colored with autumnal tints, talking about autumn colors. He says, it is the duty of the pilgrim to the battlefield to look, to see, to hear, but not to speak. Gentlemen of Gettysburg, I thank you for your attention and bid you good night. And he will spend some time over 3 days touring the battlefield with Batchelder and with others. The time he spends on the second and third days of the battlefield will far surpass those, it seems, of the time that he spent on the first day's battlefield. But the New York Herald, which will be picked up by Aaron Jerome, John Buford's former signal officer during the battle, he notices that inside of this account, the Herald mentions that Hancock does stop where Reynolds was killed, where Barlow was wounded, and where General Armistead, Confederate General Lewis Armistead, was mortally wounded. And so there are a couple of officers who died during the battle or the course of the war who Hancock seems to pay particular favor to. Local coverage of Hancock's visit after he leaves will of course be prevalent, but there will also be stories about his time here and the likes of Pittsburgh, Washington, D.C., Chicago, Cleveland, and Detroit. Now, 11 years later, fast forwarding in our story a bit, in 1876, December of that year, Hancock publishes an essay simply titled Gettysburg in a magazine called The Galaxy, subtitled a magazine of entertaining reading. And inside of it, he will sort of make his claim to what he did during the battle, especially on July 1st, sort of choosing the ground where I am on Cemetery Hill as a possible Union fallback point. And he starts to cite several cases where he was aware of what General John Buford knew as the Union Cavalry Division commander here earlier on July 1st. And Hancock would say, I also have in my possession a letter from Buford's signal officer, Lieutenant A.B. Jerome. Now, Aaron Jerome is an under-recognized figure, as I mentioned a bit ago. We don't know a lot about him. He appears to have been born on June 27th, 1838, meaning that he's around 24, 25 years old. He might have been born a year or so after that at the time of the battle. He's an orphan. By the time we even get to the 1850s, his father died at about age 26. His mother was about 33. He appears on the 1850 census in the town of Orange in Essex County, New Jersey, just west of New York City. And at the outbreak of the Civil War, he is going to enlist in the 1st New Jersey Volunteers. He'll eventually transfer to what was then the brand new United States Signal Corps, and he'll be commissioned just a few months before the Battle of Gettysburg in March of 1863 as a 1st lieutenant in the Signal Corps. He'll serve with distinction throughout the course of the conflict, and ultimately he will write this letter to Hancock, this letter that Hancock mentions having. And in that letter, Jerome says, "General, in all the parade that has taken place since the Battle of Gettysburg, of names and incidences, memories oratorical and poetical, from Edward Everett at the dedication of the National Cemetery to General Howard at the dedication of the National Monument, have you not noticed that your friend, the heroic Buford, has been nearly disregarded? I was a young lieutenant and signal officer, and I loved General Buford, and I am sure you will pardon me if I call your attention to this injustice." And then he states the purpose of his letter. He says, "This letter has been suggested by a paragraph in the New York papers stating that you had just returned from Gettysburg and giving an account of your remarks." And this is written on October 18th, 1865. Hancock has been at Gettysburg just about a week earlier, and Jerome sees in the New York Herald or other New York papers Hancock was here, but he didn't mention Buford in his speech. And Jerome basically is telling Hancock, maybe you're just simply unaware of what exactly General Buford did on July 1st, 1863. And so he opens his letter by describing a bit about what he remembers, what Jerome recalls from being here during the battle, just telling Hancock the things that maybe he wasn't aware of. He says, "A few moments after the death of Major General John Reynolds," this would be on the morning of July 1st, "the late General Buford wrote a short dispatch in my notebook to Major General Meade. If that message could be found, it would add greater luster to your well-won reputation." He says, as he recalls, that the message stated, "For God's sake, send up Hancock. Everything is going at odds. We need a controlling spirit." In the official records, we can find that Jerome is pretty much right. There is a message that Buford wrote at 3:20 p.m. on July 1st, saying, "In my opinion, there seems to be no directing person. We need help now." The other contents of Jerome's letter regarding Buford are the familiar details that we have of Buford and his division holding on to the ridges west of Gettysburg, and Aaron Jerome, as Buford's signal officer, saying that he took his position in what he referred to as the steeple of the theological seminary, meaning the cupola there. He mentions that General Buford came up and looked at the Confederates through my glass and formed his small cavalry force, placing Buford himself in the cupola. The early accounts that we have come from Jerome regarding Buford's presence in that space. He talks then about the defense of Gettysburg to the west and how famously General Reynolds had ridden up the Emmitsburg Road in the moments just before his death, how Buford was at the cupola when Reynolds arrived, and how the two will have a brief conference. And he says in this account, does Jerome, that General Reynolds asked Buford how things were going and received the characteristic answer, "Let's go and see." There are not as many details in this 1865 account as there would be a couple of years later when Jerome writes a second account in 1867. That's a story for another time, but that's where we get the line, "The devil's to pay," from Buford, or that the men would have to fight like the devil. Those sort of details are not included yet in Jerome's initial account. Now, what are the legacies of this letter that Jerome wrote to Hancock, in which he included these details of what we know about Buford here at Gettysburg? Well, we know, for one, that Hancock kept the letter and eventually published it for posterity, as I mentioned, in 1876, 11 years after he initially received it. And for that, we should be thankful that Hancock preserved that letter so that we would know what it says. It is eventually republished as well in the Batchelder Papers, a valuable source containing many first-hand accounts of Gettysburg veterans. Though this 1865 Jerome account, as I mentioned, is not quite as detailed, It is closer, though, into the events that happened. He writes it in 1865, just 2 years after the battle. Another legacy, perhaps, is that it's a case where Jerome probably could have taken credit for himself if he so chose. Buford had died just a few months after the battle of typhoid fever, but Jerome will elect to promote Buford's stature rather than his own. And I think a really kind of powerful legacy of this is how each of these men, Jerome and Hancock, ended, and that's how I will end as well. Jerome closed his letter to Hancock by saying, "Excuse me, General, but it will be difficult to find a parallel in history to the resistance made by a small force of cavalry against such odds of infantry as there was on July 1st, 1863. Will you not endeavor to bring General Buford's name more prominently forward? Everyone knows that in his day he was first and foremost." And this is a letter that did much of what Jerome wanted it to do. It has inspired many accounts that have been reprinted in Gettysburg books, in novels, in film, and perhaps brings people to Gettysburg and to that cupola still today. Hancock's response to Buford, to Jerome, about Buford, he says that in my report of the Battle of Gettysburg, I did not fail to mention General Buford in fitting terms, and he cites what he had written in his official report. He talks about regretting, though, that I did not know of Buford's previous services on that day. And he promises Lieutenant Jerome, "I am not only glad to know that Buford, who was a good friend of mine, always spoke of me as you relate, but it has given me an opportunity, which I shall profit of by bringing his deeds in more prominence in histories being published from this point forward." And so there is an answer to one of our questions of how do we know what we know, looking a little bit more in depth at Aaron Jerome, at General Winfield Scott Hancock and his return to Gettysburg, and how veterans' presence on this battlefield would spark conversations amongst them, leading ultimately to sources that we have today, giving us further answers to all these unsolved Gettysburg questions. Thank you as always for tuning in to Beyond the Ridge, Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center's web series, where we continue to bring you stories and interpretations of race, religion, medicine, and war from the 19th century and beyond. Again, my name is Codie Eash, and I look forward to seeing you on the Ridge soon.